Which brings us nicely on to our last topic. A growing idea. We have a new spokesperson for the Corbynite left in a man called Gary Stevenson, who's been on the IEA podcast, Kristian, with you a couple of years ago, who was talking about a wealth tax. And so this idea of a wealth tax is taking off again. I think one of the specific proposals that I've seen is 2% charged on wealth over 10 million. But I'd like to ask the question about wealth taxes in the broader sense. Tom, what's the arguments for and against a wealth tax?
I don't think there's much of an argument for a wealth tax, so we can skip over that one pretty quickly. I'll let other people try and make the case for it and then poke holes. But I think it's a terrible idea. It's a truly, truly bad idea, a wealth tax, and I think it would be extraordinarily economically destructive if we went down this route in the UK. Can't imagine for a second that the government would actually consider it. But look, I think one of the reasons that people think, oh, well, that doesn't sound unreasonable, 2%. I mean, what's 2% to a billionaire? But you're not comparing like with like. So a wealth tax is a tax on a stock. It's not a tax on a flow like capital gains tax would be or dividend tax would be. And if you try and make those percentages equivalent, a 2% tax on a stock of wealth, which is growing at, say, 5% a year, is equivalent to taxing the return on capital at 40%. 40% equivalent to the higher rate of tax. But bear in mind, we're already taxing the return on capital in a variety of ways. So at the corporate level, 25% corporation tax. At the individual level, what are the top level? 39.5% on dividends, 24% on most capital gains with the changes that are coming in. Now, you can't simply add up marginal rates to create a total tax rate because you're kind of reducing the tax base at each stage of that process. Nevertheless, on those assumptions that I've outlined, you pretty quickly end up with 80% of the return on investment is being taken up in tax if you introduce a net wealth tax of this sort. Now, that's without accounting for inflation, by the way. So inflation will probably take another little nibble out of that bite as well. And I think you just have to ask yourself, if you were taxing the return on capital at 80% in the UK and other countries are available, who in their right mind is going to invest or start a business in Britain? And of course, it's not just about people who are very rich now. It's about anyone who might like to be really rich in future. We've already got a big problem, tens of thousands of millionaires leaving the UK. And we have a greater exodus than any country except China of rich people. Yeah, we have a stagnant economy. We talk about this all the time. Taxes, although the British tax system is not by any stretch the worst in the world, it's not by any stretch of the imagination one of the most competitive in the world either. And let's just go back to this specific proposal, right? The 2% tax on assets over 10 million every year. They say every year this will raise 24 billion. Now, it's just about plausible that if you did a one-off surprise wealth tax and caught everyone unaware, you would raise 24 billion in the first year. And they take a lot of their figures from a guy called Aaron Advani, who is at University of Warwick, and he's a good economist. And I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that he comes up with, but his research is serious, well put together research. But the whole point, and he and another guy at the LSE, Andy Summers, I think, did this UK wealth tax commission after COVID. And the idea was if we did a one-off wealth tax to kind of try and fill the big fiscal hole we had at the end of the pandemic, how would you structure it? How much tax could you raise? But their whole case was predicated on it being one-off. And so I know they've got this 24 billion figure from Aaron's tax calculator that came alongside that report. But if you read the report of that wealth tax commission, they say the evidence from other countries that have imposed net wealth taxes is that you lose, so for a 1% tax, you lose between 7 and 17% of your tax base every year that the tax is enforced to tax on, basically to people changing their behaviour, to moving their investments overseas or whatever. So it might be 24 billion the first year. I still doubt it, but it's gonna fall pretty quickly. And that's just the wealth tax revenue. Think of the tax revenues you're losing elsewhere as a result of these people moving overseas, because we are in a progressive income tax system so reliant on the richest income taxpayers for a huge percentage of tax revenue. So I think this would be disastrous fiscally. I think it would be disastrous economically, and it would also just mark Britain out as basically an idiot country. to put it in rather brutal terms. And I know people are going to say, but Switzerland has a wealth tax. Okay, yes, Switzerland does have a wealth tax, but I don't think they have a capital gains tax, and I think they tax lots of other things at much lower rate. And they also, in some of the cantons, offer these kind of sweetheart deals where if you're rich enough, you can just agree how much tax you're going to pay, and that's the cost of living there. Fine. Switzerland, contrary to an old Niemietz meme, is not the answer to every question.
No, but they get so many other things right that they can really get away with a wealth tax. So if we can also get their healthcare system, their pension system, their level of decentralization, and their overall tax level, and their overall ratio of public spending to GDP, then and if as a part of that package deal we get their wealth tax, then I say we should take it. But that is not really on the table right now. Otherwise, Switzerland is an unusual example in that particular respect, because wealth taxes were once, in the last century, a fairly common form of taxation. So lots of countries had net wealth taxes of one form or another. It's just that over time, most of them have abandoned them. I think there's now just 4 or 5 OECD countries left that still have something that you could describe as a wealth tax, and they've been abandoned for good reason. It was often that governments, including left-wing governments, just realized, okay, this tax raises barely any revenue. It has all these negative economic side effects, and it's also a bureaucratic nightmare to administer, because you have to issue that. If you tax a flow, of course, you can quite easily work out what the flow is. It's usually some easily verifiable number. Say it's a transfer from one person to another, and you can just apply a tax rate to that. With wealth, the stock has to be constantly re-evaluated. At the moment, if we wanted to introduce it, we wouldn't even know where to begin because we don't have a wealth registry. And that is usually the problem, that, okay, if somebody has all their wealth in stocks and bonds in a financial portfolio, that's easy enough. But quite often it's things that are harder to value, say property in a place where there aren't many transactions, and you just don't know how much would you get if you were to sell that house today. And that was the issue with the West German wealth tax. That was the reason why it was declared unconstitutional, that they had this issue that for financial instruments, stocks and bonds, okay, fair enough, that works. But for property valuation, it was just fairly arbitrary, and that's an issue which would be, I guess, would be even more extreme in Britain. So that's already an issue with council tax, that it's still based on the value of 1991 of the property values, what they were then, and then just updated with inflation. For council tax, I guess that doesn't really matter, because that link to property wealth has become largely symbolic, and we just see it as a fee by the local council rather than as a property tax as such. Before wealth tax, it would matter. So those are some of the reasons why countries that have previously had wealth taxes have abolished them in the main. So the trend has really been away from them, including under left-wing governments. And that's one of my problems with this wealth tax movement that has sprung up around Gary Stevenson, where I say this in his defense. We had, as you said, we've had him on this program. I think 3 years ago or so. He was a good faith debater, which I wasn't expecting. I was expecting him to do a Monbiot and just accuse us of being shills for the 4 corporate plutocrats. He didn't do that. He argued in good faith, and that's quite rare among leftists nowadays. But I did notice as when I asked him a practical question, I think I brought up this example of the West German wealth tax that was then abolished for all the practical problems, and mentioned that it didn't bring in much revenue anyway. That there, once you bring up questions of that nature, he becomes evasive. He doesn't want to talk about that. He just goes back to saying, yes, but things were fine here in the 50s and 60s. Well, okay, here. To the extent that that's true, it was for completely different reasons. And that's also where he too quickly makes his wealth tax thing, he turns it into a theory of everything. He then starts talking about how his father, who is or was a postal worker, was able to afford a house in whatever, the 70s or so, and talks about how that isn't possible today. Well, all true. But that's got nothing to do with concentration of wealth. That happens for a completely different reason, and the mechanism is totally different. We also see if So his argument is it's all these wealthy people buying up all the housing stock, but they don't. We have a very low rate of second home ownership. That's really not the reason. It can't be that.
I did look at so Oxfam were involved, surprise, surprise, in this campaign as well, along with the Tax Justice UK. Big surprise there too. And I looked at a report that Oxfam had done, I think, a year or two ago, calling for sort of wealth taxes globally. And one of their sort of metrics for assessing how high a wealth tax should be is to basically keep billionaires' wealth constant so that it can't grow anymore. And I mean, maybe this is just illustrative. It made for nice, colourful charts and everything. But genuinely, I think this is the way that some people on the left think about things. It's not actually about making anybody better off. It's not really about redistribution. It is simply distaste at wealth and wealth growing. And they simply don't think that people deserve to be that rich. Like sort of from a purely sort of colloquial standpoint or whatever, I get that. But on the other hand, people say, well, you're rich enough already. Let's take Jeff Bezos, okay, the world's most successful bookseller. He was a billionaire from selling books. Did he really need to get any richer? And people will say, no, that's plenty for one man. Okay, well, you forget about all of the people he employs and all of the other businesses he goes on to start. But then, okay, we'll go into science fiction a bit here. Jeff Bezos' enormous wealth has allowed him to get into space exploration. But the point is, when people have enormous amounts of wealth, they're not just sitting on it for the most part. Maybe some are. But for the most part, this is invested in productive things, in new ventures, in things which make the rest of us richer and make our society just better off and, creates that sense of progress. And I think people just don't see that, right, on the left. And so they say they've got enough, we should take it and we should give it to people who deserve it more. Unfortunately, that is just a horrible and I think completely destructive way to see the world.
I think you're completely right, obviously. And I think we've dealt with the wealth tax issue extremely efficiently and well there. And I'm sure that'll be the end of the discussion, so everybody else can stop talking about it. Yeah. But that is all we've got time for, unfortunately. If you want more from us, then stay tuned for our podcasts next week and every week. And follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thank you very much.